Can you believe it's been 50 years since we first met the Corleone family? 50 years on, The Godfather has taken its place high on the list of classic Hollywood movies.
For 52 years, millions of people have watched the opening scene of The Godfather. Marlon Brando sits in his dimly lit office, stroking a cat, listening to requests on his daughter's wedding day. It's one of the most iconic images in cinema history. But there's something in that frame, something hiding in plain sight that nobody caught. And when you see it, you'll realize it's everywhere in the film, in every major scene, before every death, during every betrayal. It's a visual code that Francis Ford Coppola embedded into the movie, and for half a century, audiences walked right past it. But to understand why this detail matters, and how it almost never made it into the film at all, we need to go back to 1970, when Paramount Pictures was about to greenlight what they thought would be their biggest disaster: the chaotic production. Paramount Pictures was hemorrhaging money in 1970. The studio had released 15 films that year, and 12 of them bombed. They were so desperate for cash that they sold their entire film library to raise capital. When producer Albert Ruddy brought them Mario Puzo's unpublished manuscript about an Italian crime family, the executives weren't exactly thrilled. They bought the rights for $12,500, which even in 1970 was borderline insulting. The book hadn't even hit shelves yet. They figured if it flopped as a novel, they'd just quietly shelve the project and pretend it never happened. But then the book came out in March 1969, and stayed on the bestseller list for 67 weeks straight. Suddenly, Paramount had a problem. They owned the rights to what was becoming a cultural phenomenon, but they had absolutely no idea how to turn it into a movie. The violence, the Italian dialogue, the 3-hour runtime Puzo envisioned. Everything about it screamed box office poison to studio executives who were already on thin ice with their shareholders. Finding a director became a nightmare that dragged on for months. Sergio Leone turned it down. Arthur Penn said no. Costa Gavras passed. Richard Brooks, Franklin Schaffner, Fred Zinnemann all refused. By the time they got to Francis Ford Coppola, he was literally the 29th choice. And even Coppola didn't want to do it at first. He thought it was a pulpy exploitation film beneath his artistic ambitions. But Coppola was $20,000 in debt, and his production company, American Zoetrope, was collapsing. When Paramount offered him the job at a fraction of what established directors would command, he swallowed his pride and took it. He needed the money that badly. The studio gave him $100,000 to direct, which sounds reasonable until you realize they were planning to make the film for under $2 million total. Coppola's first move was to completely rewrite the script with Mario Puzo, transforming it from a simple gangster story into an epic about family, power, and the corruption of the American dream. The executives hated every word of it. They wanted a cheap mob movie they could dump into theaters and forget about. Coppola was trying to make art. Then came the casting wars, and this is where things got truly brutal. Coppola wanted Marlon Brando for Don Vito Corleone. Paramount's response was simple: absolutely not. Under any circumstances, never happening. Brando's last 4 films had been commercial disasters. He was considered difficult, unpredictable, and according to one studio memo, box office poison. The head of Paramount literally told Coppola that he would rather the film not get made than cast Marlon Brando. But Coppola was stubborn to the point of career destruction. He secretly filmed a screen test with Brando, who showed up and transformed himself using tissue paper in his cheeks to create the drooping jowls, slicking his hair back, speaking in that raspy whisper. When Coppola showed the executives, they were stunned. But they still didn't want him. They agreed to cast Brando under 3 conditions. He would work for free, taking only a percentage of profits. He would personally post a bond guaranteeing his professional behavior, and he would agree to be personally liable for any cost overruns his behavior might cause. The Al Pacino situation was somehow even worse. Pacino was a complete unknown outside of New York theater circles. The studio wanted Robert Redford, Warren Beatty, Ryan O'Neal, Jack Nicholson, basically anyone with box office appeal. Coppola insisted on Pacino for Michael Corleone, believing only he could portray the transformation from war hero to cold-blooded killer. Paramount reluctantly agreed, but 3 weeks into filming, they tried to fire him. The dailies looked terrible, they said. Pacino seemed too small, too quiet, too internal. The executives wanted him replaced immediately with Robert De Niro or Martin Sheen. Coppola threatened to quit. The standoff lasted for days until they filmed the restaurant scene where Michael murders Sollozzo and McCluskey. When the executives saw that footage, the raw violence of Pacino's performance, they finally backed down. One scene saved his career. On-set secrets and hidden details. The first day of filming created the most iconic image in the movie by complete accident. A stray cat wandered onto the Paramount soundstage while Coppola was setting up Don Corleone's office. Without a word, Coppola picked it up and handed it to Brando. Nobody scripted this. Brando started stroking the cat, and they rolled the camera. The problem was the cat purred so loudly it ruined the audio. They had to completely re-record Brando's dialogue later. But Coppola kept it because the image of this powerful, violent man gently stroking a purring cat perfectly captured Vito Corleone's duality, brutal and tender. That accidental cat became the visual thesis of the entire film. But here's the detail everyone missed, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Oranges appear in the frame immediately before every death in The Godfather. Not some deaths, every single one. This wasn't an accident. Coppola and cinematographer Gordon Willis embedded this visual code throughout the film as a death omen, drawing from Italian Renaissance symbolism about mortality. Watch the movie again, and you'll see it everywhere. Don Vito stops at a fruit stand to buy oranges, smiling and completely at ease. Then he gets shot 5 times and collapses, oranges rolling everywhere. When Tessio unknowingly sets up his own execution at the meeting of the 5 families, there's a fruit bowl in the background, oranges. When Michael eliminates all his enemies in the baptism sequence, oranges appear in nearly every death scene. Gordon Willis confirmed this years later. In classic still life paintings, particularly from the Italian Renaissance, fruit symbolized life's fleeting nature. Oranges, which rot quickly once picked, were especially potent mortality symbols. Willis and Coppola used this as subtle visual language, signaling death to attentive viewers without telegraphing it obviously. If you don't notice it, the scenes still work perfectly. But if you do, the entire film takes on an additional layer of dread and inevitability. There's another detail working in tandem with the oranges. The puppet strings. Production designer Dean Tavoularis specifically chose Renaissance paintings for Don Corleone's office, depicting saints and biblical figures in poses of control. This visual motif of manipulation, of invisible hands controlling visible actions, runs throughout the film. When Michael takes over, the camera lingers on similar artwork in his office. The Don controls his family like a puppet master controls marionettes, through invisible strings of obligation and loyalty. This extends to hand gestures. Brando created a specific rolling motion when Don Vito speaks, suggesting both benediction and manipulation. Every male character eventually copies this gesture. Sonny uses it to assert authority. Tom Hagen during negotiations. Michael begins using it more as he transforms into the new Godfather. By the final scene when Michael lies to Kay and the door closes on her, his hands move in exactly the same pattern as his father's in the opening. He's become the puppet master. The 30-minute wedding opening contains another missed detail. Large portions are in Italian without subtitles. Test audiences complained they couldn't understand what was happening. The studio begged Coppola to add subtitles. He refused. The choice was intentional. Coppola wanted non-Italian viewers to feel like outsiders looking into a closed world, experiencing the same exclusion Michael feels returning from war. But here's the secret. If you speak Italian, you'll find background conversations contain hints about future plot points. Two old men argue about Solozzo in Sicilian dialect, mentioning his drug ambitions a full hour before it becomes important. Coppola buried clues in plain sight, knowing most viewers would never catch them. The butchered cut and studio interference. The first test screening was an unmitigated disaster. Coppola's cut ran 2 hours and 55 minutes. The audience sat through it in near silence. When the lights came up, people didn't applaud, they just left. The comment cards were brutal, too long, too dark, too much talking. The studio executives who had already hated the project now had ammunition. One executive stood up in the meeting afterward and said the film should be cut to 2 hours maximum, or it shouldn't be released at all. He suggested cutting the entire opening wedding sequence, the hospital scene where Michael saves his father, and most of the Sicily subplot. Basically, everything that made the film something more than a standard crime thriller. Coppola went into a spiral of panic and depression. He spent 72 hours in the editing room, barely sleeping, trying to figure out how to trim the film without destroying it. His editor, Walter Murch, later said Coppola was seriously considering walking away from the project entirely, convinced his career was over either way. But then something strange happened. A young executive at Paramount named Peter Bart screened the full cut for a different audience, mostly younger viewers who hadn't been to the disastrous test screening. This audience loved it. They sat riveted for the entire runtime. The comment cards praised the length, saying it felt epic. Bart took this data back to the studio heads and argued that the problem wasn't the film, it was the test audience. He convinced them to leave most of Coppola's cut intact, trimming only about 8 minutes of redundant material. Those 8 minutes mattered, though. There was originally an extended sequence showing Luca Brasi's death from multiple angles, really drawing out the horror of him being strangled with piano wire. Coppola cut it because he realized the impact was greater if the death happened quickly and brutally, the way real violence erupts. There was also a longer version of Sonny's beating death at the toll booth, showing his body being riddled with bullets for almost a full minute. Again, Coppola trimmed it because the audience's imagination was more horrifying than anything he could show. This became a crucial lesson. Less was more. Restraint was more terrifying than excess. The studio had another major problem with the film that went beyond runtime: Gordon Willis's cinematography. Willis earned the nickname the Prince of Darkness because he lit scenes so dimly that actors' faces often fell into shadow. This was intentional and brilliant. Willis believed that mobsters lived in moral darkness, and the lighting should reflect that. But the studio hated it. Projectionists complained they couldn't see the actors' eyes. Executives worried audiences would think something was wrong with the print. Willis refused to budge, and Coppola backed him. If you watch carefully, you'll notice that the lighting in scenes directly correlates to power dynamics. When Don Vito is strong and in control, his face is lit. When he's weak or losing power, he falls into shadow. When Michael is still innocent, he's often shown in natural light. As he becomes more corrupt, the shadows creep in until by the end of the film, he's lit exactly like his father, half his face in darkness. Release chaos and unexpected success. Paramount's marketing department had zero faith in The Godfather. Their strategy was to do a limited release in 5 cities, see how it performed, and expand slowly if it didn't completely bomb. They allocated a tiny marketing budget compared to other major releases that year. Meanwhile, Coppola was dealing with a different problem entirely. The Italian-American Civil Rights League, led by Joe Colombo, an actual mob boss, began protesting the film. They claimed it perpetuated negative stereotypes about Italian Americans. The League organized picket lines at Paramount's offices. They threatened to shut down production. There were even reports of actual death threats against cast members, though how serious these were remains unclear. Coppola, being Italian-American himself, met with Colombo and made a deal. He agreed to remove the words Mafia and Cosa Nostra from the script entirely. In exchange, the League dropped the protests, and some members even worked as extras and consultants, adding an uncomfortable layer of authenticity. The film premiered on March 15, 1972, at the Loews State Theater in New York City. The audience gave it a standing ovation that lasted several minutes, but the critical reception was mixed. The New York Times review was actually negative, calling it a sentimental glorification of gangsterism. Other critics praised the performances, but questioned whether America needed another violent crime film. What nobody predicted was the word of mouth. People who saw it told everyone they knew. Lines formed around city blocks. The limited release strategy backfired spectacularly because there weren't enough theaters showing it to meet demand. Paramount rapidly expanded to wide release. Within weeks, The Godfather was breaking box office records that had stood for years. It made over $86 million in its initial North American release, and eventually crossed $250 million worldwide. It became the highest-grossing film of all time, a record it held until Star Wars came out 5 years later. The cultural impact was immediate and strange. Restaurants reported surges in Italian food orders. Baby boys named Michael and Vito spiked in birth records. People started quoting lines like, "I'm gonna make him an offer he can't refuse," in everyday conversation. The film had somehow transcended entertainment and become a cultural touchstone. The Academy Awards in 1973 felt like vindication for Coppola. The Godfather received 10 nominations, including Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor for Brando, and Best Supporting Actor for both Pacino and Cayenne. It won 3 Oscars for Best Picture, Best Actor, and Best Adapted Screenplay. But the ceremony is remembered for what Brando did. He refused to accept his Oscar, instead sending a Native American activist named Sachin Littlefeather to decline it on his behalf as a protest against Hollywood's treatment of Native Americans. The television audience was shocked. Some people booed. It remains one of the most controversial moments in Oscar history. But it also cemented The Godfather's legacy as a film that challenged conventions, even at its moment of greatest mainstream acceptance. Cultural impact and legacy details. The Godfather didn't just succeed financially. It fundamentally altered what American cinema could be. Before 1972, studios believed that serious dramatic films needed to be released in the fall and winter for Oscar consideration, while summer was reserved for light entertainment. The Godfather proved that an epic, violent, 3-hour character study could dominate the summer box office. It paved the way for the blockbuster era that Jaws and Star Wars would fully realize a few years later. But unlike those films, The Godfather maintained critical respectability. It showed that popular and prestigious weren't mutually exclusive categories. The film launched careers and resurrected others. Al Pacino went from an unknown stage actor to one of the biggest movie stars in the world almost overnight. He would go on to define an entire era of American acting. Robert De Niro, who had a tiny part in the original film, was cast as young Vito Corleone in The Godfather Part 2 specifically because Coppola saw something in his brief appearance. That sequel would win De Niro his first Oscar James Caan became a leading man. Robert Duvall's career transformed. Even actors with small roles like Abe Vigoda found lasting fame. The visual language of The Godfather infected everything that came after it. The warm amber tones that Willis used became the standard color palette for period crime films. The shadowy lighting inspired decades of cinematographers. The slow, deliberate pacing influenced how directors approached dramatic scenes. Watch Breaking Bad, The Sopranos, Boardwalk Empire, or any prestige crime drama from the last 30 years. The DNA of The Godfather is visible in every frame. Vince Gilligan has openly said he watched The Godfather before directing every season premiere of Breaking Bad. David Chase structured entire episodes of The Sopranos around visual callbacks to Coppola's film. And then there's the Orange Code, which became a secret language among filmmakers. Once directors and cinematographers learned about Coppola's death symbolism, they started using it in their own work as both homage and storytelling device. In Breaking Bad, oranges appear before multiple major character deaths. In Better Call Saul, there's a scene where oranges spill across the ground right before a brutal act of violence. Narcos uses the orange motif repeatedly. It's become an inside joke and a legitimate narrative tool simultaneously. Filmmakers know that a certain segment of the audience will catch it and feel the dread building, while everyone else just sees fruit. The Godfather spawned 2 sequels, though only Part 2 is considered on par with the original. Part 3, released in 1990, was more controversial and divided audiences. But, taken together, the trilogy represents one of the most ambitious narrative experiments in American film history. Coppola took a pulp novel about gangsters and transformed it into a multi-generational saga about power, family, corruption, and the American dream's dark underbelly. The fact that it succeeded both commercially and artistically still seems almost impossible. So, now you know. The detail everyone missed for 52 years was hiding in plain sight the entire time. Oranges, death omens scattered throughout the film like breadcrumbs leading to tragedy. The puppet strings are woven into the production design. The hand gestures that mark the transformation from father to son. These weren't accidents or happy coincidences. They were the result of a director and cinematographer working at the absolute peak of their abilities, embedding layers of meaning that reward repeat viewings and close attention.